Okay, in this tutorial I'm going to look at the different parts of the brain. So in our topic on the nervous system, we really can't escape looking at the brain. So the brain is such a key, vital, central part of the nervous system. And all of what you see here is really comprised of those neurons. So, the parts of the brain. There are 5 major parts we're going to look at, and we're not going to spend a heap of time looking at them in detail, but just describe their basic functions. So we've got the cerebrum, which is the larger portion of the brain, the outer part of the brain, the cerebellum, or little brain at the back here, the brainstem, and then if we look inside the brain, the corpus callosum, this interior bit here, and the hypothalamus, this bit here. Alright, so those are the key parts we're going to look at in this topic. Alright, so let's start with the cerebrum. The cerebrum has many folds that increases the number of neurons in this area. So it increases the surface area. Now the cerebrum is basically what, if you put your hand on your head, just underneath the skull, inside your skull would be the cerebrum. It's the largest part of the brain. Of the parts we're going to look at, and it's divided into two halves, the right and the left hemisphere. So the right hand side of your body controls the left hand side, the right hand side of your brain controls the left hand side of your body, and vice versa. So the wires that connect the brain up to the body actually cross over, alright, and so it's the left side that controls the right side of the body, and it's the right side that controls the left side of the body. So this outer layer is essentially, it has all these folds just to increase the surface area. And if we look at animals that are I guess more evolved or have evolved more recently, a lot of them tend to have a larger number of folds. Or animals that we would consider as being more intelligent often have larger and more folded brains. Now the outer layer, if you were to cut through it, you'd notice it's only sort of the outer maybe inch is sort of a grey colour when it turns grey, a greyish colour when the brain's sort of preserved. And this is called the cortex, so it's the outer layer that contains all the interneurons that really do all the processing. Just underneath that is a white layer, so we call that, so we have the grey matter and the white matter. The white matter is, again, it's interneurons, but they tend to be myelinated. So they tend to be myelinated, and they really essentially just act, those are the cables that connect different parts of the brain together. So it's the outer surface of the brain here, of the cerebrum, that does the large majority of our processing, the thinking, if you will. So if we look at the cerebrum, this is sort of a bit of extra for experts. You're not really expected to know all of this detail, but the cerebrum is divided into 4 parts or lobes. The frontal lobe, which is the blue part here, which is really associated with reasoning and planning and parts of speech, movement, emotions, problem solving, sort of the higher thinking kind of stuff. So when you stop and ponder a problem, it's probably really your frontal lobe that you're thinking, using to problem solve. Now the frontal lobe is still developing in teenagers. I've put that down the bottom here. As a teenager, your prefrontal cortex is still developing. So what does that control? What does that mean? Well, it means that teenagers, in terms of your, can be a bit emotional, but in terms of your problem solving as well, your ability to problem solve and reason out things isn't fully developed. And that's probably one of the reasons why we sort of decide that it's only when you're 18 that you're allowed to vote and things like that. So that part of your brain is still actually developing a little bit. So the parietal lobe, the yellow part at the back here, the parietal lobe, is associated with movement, orientation, recognition of perception of stimuli and things like that. The occipital lobe is the bit at the back, and that's associated with visual processing. And the temporal lobe, so just behind your temple, is associated with perception and recognition of auditory stimuli, memory and speech. So there's definitely a few parts here that are really are involved in speech. Some people, when they have a stroke, what happens then is part of the brain becomes starved of oxygen, or starved of a blood flow, and it becomes damaged. If you get damage in some parts of the temporal lobe, that can definitely affect your speech. And not only your speech in terms of your ability to talk, but it may affect your ability to associate sounds with meanings. So, for instance, you may still have an idea of words in your head, but you may not be able to say words properly. You may want to say a sentence and go to say it, but if that part of the brain is damaged, you might get random words or random sounds coming out of your mouth. So it's quite a scary thought, and it's a very rare occurrence, but there are people who have kind of woken up and have had a stroke or had damage to that part of the brain, and they go to say something and nothing but sort of jargon and gobbledygook actually comes out of their mouth. So this is really where, I guess, also it's not just speech in terms of controlling our mouth, but also sort of where the dictionary and where we associate words with meanings and all those sorts of things are. So it's associated with auditory perception as well, kind of the language center, I guess, of the brain. Alright, the cerebellum, or the little brain. So the little brain is similar to the cerebrum. It has two hemispheres. It's got a left and a right, so either side of the brain. And this is really associated with the regulation of coordination and movement, posture, balance, things like that. So this is what keeps you upright. It's signals that get sent to here from the air that, you know, if you're swirling around, that might make you sort of a bit dizzy. And this is really, if this part isn't functioning properly, you'd be staggering all over the place, falling over. You wouldn't be able to keep yourself upright, essentially. This is the part of the brain that's really responsible for that movement, your sense of position and balance. So this is probably much older in an evolutionary sense than the cerebrum. What does that statement mean? Well, it just means that this probably developed before the rest of the brain, before the cerebrum sort of really evolved. And that's probably because that ability to stay upright and move around was probably more fundamentally important than the ability to think and problem solve. So evolution, you know, primarily animals are driven to find food and energy so that they can reproduce and survive. Whereas the higher thinking is kind of secondary to that. If we don't have the necessary functions to survive, well, being able to think things through isn't really going to help us any. Alright, so the cerebellum, little brain, controlling things like movement and posture and balance. The brainstem. So the brainstem is probably the simplest and the most ancient, in an evolutionary sense, part of the brain. So it's responsible for our vital life functions, such as breathing, our heartbeat, and our blood pressure. So this is often what we'd say is the simplest part of the brain. And some sort of reptiles, animals, or things that appear relatively early in the evolutionary tree, have been around for a long time, often have very basic brain stems, or rather they have a decent brain stem, but they lack much of the rest of the brain. They don't really have much of any of the other parts. They don't really have a large cerebrum or cerebellum. Their brain consists largely or mostly of just the brain stem. And so that tells us they're probably quite primitive animals with probably little thinking, more sort of a bundle of reflexes, and just, you know, controlling those basic sort of functions, so less capable of higher order thinking. So the brainstem, all you need to know, guys, brainstem controls those most basic functions, the things like heartbeat, blood pressure, and breathing. Alright, the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is what connects the two halves of the brain together. So it allows communication between the two hemispheres, or between the two halves. And essentially, basically, it just transfers motor, sensory, cognitive, which just means thought, information between the two halves of the brain. So our brain actually has these two halves, and they kind of have to communicate a little bit between each other. What's interesting, though, is there are actually some people on the planet, I believe one of them's even like a high court judge, who actually are missing part of the brain, either one of the lobes on one side, or I've even heard of an individual surviving with literally only half the brain. That will affect their personality and things like that, depending on which parts have been removed. But apparently you can survive with half a brain, because now obviously that half of the brain which might affect the control over the opposite side of the body. The person obviously will have issues controlling and moving those parts of the body. But in terms of thinking, apparently you don't need the full brain. So, when sometimes when people say, I wonder if he's only got half a brain, in theory they could even be correct. Alright, so corpus callosum, the bit that connects the two hemispheres and allows them basically to talk to each other. Alright, lastly, the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is kind of the junction between our electrical system, our nervous system, and our hormone system, the endocrine system. And so it controls things like body temperature, emotions, hunger, thirst, and sleep patterns. Things that ultimately have a hormonal component. So hormones affect our emotions, hormones affect our hunger and thirst levels. Things like insulin affect our blood sugar. Sleep patterns, there are sleep hormones that circulate through our blood and spike at certain times. And in terms of sleep patterns, this is basically where there's a point just on the edge of the hypothalamus, or in the hypothalamus, that essentially regulates our timing, our sense of timing. There's a little part that essentially we call our biological clock. So that tells us when it's kind of time to sleep and when it's time to get up. And just we have essentially a sense of time. Even if we were put into a dark cave and we had no idea when it was actually, when the sun was actually up or when the sun was out and when it went down, we would still go through sort of a sleep pattern of, where we were roughly asleep for, about 8 hours and then active, for the rest of the day. We'd still have roughly a day because of that internal clock that keeps ticking over. So the hypothalamus controls things like body temperature, emotion, hunger, thirst, sleep patterns, the kind of things that are affected by hormone levels. So guys, lastly, here's a link. I'll put it in the description too. It's a brain pop video, so you'll need a login, but your teacher will hopefully be able to give you one of those if they haven't done so already. So under brain pop, go to the section on health and body systems, and there's a little video there on the brain. Cool, so that's it, and we'll get on to the next video.